How did Ukraine win a battle using only robots? There is this unbelievable video I saw recently from the front lines of the war in Ukraine. And in it, you see these three Russian soldiers crawl out of a hiding place, arms up, fear on their faces. And they walk towards a camera and surrender on the snowy ground. But they're not surrendering to a Ukrainian soldier, or frankly, a soldier of any sort. They're surrendering to a robot. It was, according to the Ukrainians, the first time that an enemy position was captured solely by a battlefield robot, without putting a single soldier at risk, and a sign of how Ukraine has become a leader in the robot wars. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid, and welcome to the Global Story on YouTube. I'm going to be straight up. War, the technology of war, all of that is not something that I am an expert in. But having seen that video I just mentioned, I was struck when I heard the U.S. Army Secretary, Dan Driscoll, recently speak in glowing terms about the Ukrainian army. And what struck me more is that he seemed to be suggesting that the U.S. armed forces were learning from Ukraine. So, to help us track Ukraine's robot war revolution and how the country has transformed modern warfare, my co host, Tristan Redman, and I spoke with a defense expert who also happens to be a former BBC colleague.
I'm Mark Urban. I'm a columnist at the Sunday Times. And for my sins, I've been covering diplomacy, conflict, war, all the rest of it for a very long time. I mean, the best part of 40 years, which means that I'm old enough to have been embedded with the Soviet army in Afghanistan.
On April 13th, we saw Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, post on social media that Ukraine won a battle, essentially just with robots.
President Zelensky wanted to, in a sense, herald that this innovation had happened. We've seen Russians surrendering to drones before and being sort of given directions which way to go in order to reach Ukrainian lines, in order to surrender. But the key thing about this latest video is that it was ground vehicles. And I guess the Ukrainians have been big innovators and they wanted us to see.
Mark, as you and I were discussing just before we started recording, we were, both of us, in Ukraine in February 2022 when the war started. I remember at the time, there was a 60-mile-long convoy of armored vehicles descending on Kyiv. It was a very kind of conventional, old school, maybe Cold War style conflict at the beginning. We're a long way from that now. What's the story of how the war has actually evolved? How have we got from mass tanks to this, where you have robots actually making people surrender?
That moment you mentioned where the Russians invaded in February 22, of course, followed several years in which the Ukrainian military had been facing off against the Russians in Donbass.
Donbass being eastern Ukraine.
Eastern Ukraine, yeah, during the previous 8 years. And so had tested themselves in the real world against the Russian army before the full-scale invasion.
I see.
When the Russians invaded, it already existed, and there was already a drone capability in the Ukrainian army. It was aerial reconnaissance. It was the ability to observe by the use of drones, including quite basic ones that, hobbyists might have used to put a camera on to go and take pictures of their house from up above or whatever. A kind of off-the-shelf, Chinese-made 4-rotor drone.
That you could,
you could buy it in the duty-free store in Dubai airport or whatever.
Okay.
And so at first, this Ukrainian collective, they adapted those. So essentially, during the failure of the Russian advance on Kyiv, what we saw was the drones being used to spot for artillery. Mm-hmm. And we saw, in a sense, that artillery, which was the biggest killer in World War I and World War II, was the biggest killer, but it was just being aimed much more effectively and more quickly because you had all these eyes in the sky. And it contributed to the stalling of that Russian offensive. But they also had people who developed very effective ways of sharing data so that all the drone operators could input the data and they had a system which everyone could get onto so that they would know that the Russians were occupying that junction north of Kiev or whatever. So all of that started in the first days of the war.
So initially, eyes in the sky, but I remember at the time how things began to evolve. And very quickly, people realized that you could attach grenades to drones. And then you would get these videos where a drone would sort of try and line up with the top of a tank and then drop a grenade through an open hatch. Sometimes they would miss, sometimes it would go in, and it was like watching a kind of particularly macabre and quite dark video game. How did things evolve from there?
Well, really, if you look at the war as it evolved during that first year, the remainder of the first year, 2022, it was just the introduction on a wider and wider scale of that type of hobbyist drones. And it can be used to observe and it can be used to drop ordnance on people.
I see.
Then there were bigger quadcopters that they started to buy, octocopters, i.e. with 8 rotors and things like that, that could carry heavier mortar bombs and things, that make a bigger bang, crudely. But they were still working on the same principle, that you were trying to line them up. And of course, the Russians, while it was hovering, would be trying to shoot it down and jam it, and in every other way stop it from doing what the operator was trying to do. Towards the end of 22 and beginning of 23, you start to get the first appearance of so-called first-person view drones. Now, first person is a reference to the pilot using virtual reality goggles or a smartphone, something like that, to fly it. And that becomes a very different kind of proposition, because instead of having a little grapple on the bottom that drops the grenade off the drone, you attach something like the warhead of a rocket-propelled grenade, and you fly the drone into the target. It's a one-way ticket for that device. And your aim is to use your point of view, maybe to even explore inside a building, or to go down into a trench line, along the trench, and find out, aha, the guys are hiding in this bunker just branching off the trench, and then go in through the entrance of the bunker. So that suddenly creates a huge leap in lethality, because the first-person view drone begins to allow the operator to literally find his or her way into structures to crash the device into the target. And that really, it builds through 2023.
At this point in the story, are the Russians innovating at the same pace as the Ukrainians?
So I think if we recall what happened, the Russians, at the beginning of the war, they'd got a terrible drubbing. And at that point, I think there was quite a big reassessment done in the Russian military. Now, the Russian military is a very curious and paradoxical organization, in the sense that at the level of the soldier blundering forward to near certain death, it seems like a sort of unreformed version of something Tolstoy or someone who'd been alive in the 19th century would recognize, of, heavy drinking, bullying, coercion by commanders to force the soldiers forward when they knew they stood very little chance of coming out. All of that we see in Ukraine. But what we also see in Ukraine is that at the higher level, at the officer level and at the industrial level, the Russians start to innovate quite successfully. So the Russians then had to adopt the hobbyist solution as well, the Mavic type of drone. And then as the Ukrainians started to develop first-person view drones, the Russians also adopted those.
So they were largely playing catch-up to the Ukrainians.
It's a constant cat and mouse. At times you can't, so at times the pendulum has swung. So, for example, by the latter months of the first year of the war, the Russians have acquired quite an edge in something that traditionally they'd invested quite a lot in, which is electronic warfare. And the aim there being to interrupt the connection between the Ukrainian operator and the drone that's flying over Russian lines. So if you can successfully jam out those signals, then he'll lose control of the drone. So that's one point where they're in the lead. Then the FPVs start to come in, and the Russians apply their thinking to this question of jamming. And they literally do something which seems crazy in a way. And the Russians started connecting their first-person view drones to fiber optic cable. Within a few months, they were ordering spools of cable from China. They were coming from China that were 25 kilometers long.
So what does it mean when you have this connected, you're saying, through a fiber optic cable? It just means
You can't jam it.
I see.
So how do
You can't jam the signal. So in the end, the fiber optic guided FPV drone becomes absolutely a weapon of choice, particularly for the Russians. And you start to get these bizarre images emerging of the contested, shattered towns or forests in eastern Ukraine with a sort of glistening spider's web, because hundreds of drones had overflown them, each one leaving its own trail of fiber optic across the landscape. And these trails become so dense that you can see them sort of glistening in the sunlight. Utterly bizarre. But it starts to cause huge problems. By 2024, say, those types of FPV drone are so prevalent in the Russian system that it's causing the Ukrainians significant problems, because they were not quite as quick to get onto the innovation. But one of the really strange things that's happened in this, as the two sides have tried to match each other's innovations, is they've often been going to the same factories in China.
Oh, wow.
Whether that's for the motors, for the drones, whether it's for the fiber optic spools. And, you hear tales told. They're seeing the Russians on Tuesday and selling to them, and then seeing the Ukrainians on Wednesday.
But it's not just drones in the sky, is it? I mean, I remember big stories of drones in the Black Sea, for example. How significant has that been?
But bit by bit, the Ukrainians start to think, well, why don't we use uncrewed systems at sea as well? And so they developed I guess you'd say it's like a kind of explosive jet ski called the Magura. And they started ordering these from American people who often were just making jet skis and small boats.
Is that right?
And adapting these designs, making them a bit bigger so you could put like 800 kilos of high explosive into one. And they started using these Magura USVs, uncrewed surface vessels, against Russian ships. So they put some old Soviet-era air-to-air missiles on a couple of them. And lo and behold, a couple of years into the war, they managed to shoot down a Russian fighter jet that's coming in to land in Crimea. So they started to use it as a platform for other weapons, which I think in developmental terms is quite a key moment.
But that's the thing, Mark. You've described all this technological innovation with all these drones, all these robots. It is still perplexing as to why neither side seems to ultimately be able to win the war. I mean, unless that one is innovating and the other is just matching its innovation, maybe that's leading to the stalemate that we see.
Well, when I was a young chap going through my training, of a sort of basic training at the British Army Officer School, the thing that was drummed into you again and again was that on the modern battlefield, if you could be seen, you could be killed. And therefore, all of the tactics we were taught were about using the landscape to mask ourselves and our movements. Now, that approach is nullified when you have a drone overhead that reveals those forces moving up. And this comes down to, a concept that the military call the transparent battlefield. And what they mean by that is, through a combination of all of those thousands of drones and indeed overhead reconnaissance from satellites, all of those things, it just becomes incredibly hard to hide things. It becomes impossible to bring together the forces you need to achieve local superiority, and you have a stalemate. So effectively, what's happened with a combination of the transparent battlefield, being able to see in so much more detail, so much further into the enemy space, and then all these weapons that can be used to attack targets, from the old school artillery through to more modern drones, produces stalemate, just like it did in the First World War. There are many differences, but the idea of two sets of people facing off after the across a quite narrow piece of territory, sometimes so close that they can call out to one another, is there in 1916 and it's there in 2023 in the Donbass.
If you have a transparent battlefield, Mark, and you've talked about drones being able to operate some sort of 15 to 20 miles beyond the operator, what's the significance if that distance gets bigger and bigger?
One of the problems that the increasing range of these systems causes is that, yes, it allows each side to go deeper into enemy territory in search of targets. So whereas at the start of the war, you might be saying to yourself, well, we've got to change over our soldiers in this frontline position because these poor guys have been up there for weeks. You might have reckoned that the last 4 or 5 kilometers or whatever, as you went into that position, could be really dangerous. Now, some of the Russian reconnaissance drones, they're not used to drop bombs, going up to 40 kilometers into Ukrainian battle space. It's created a huge problem because to cover that sort of distance faster than the Russians can organize a response, it becomes really problematic. And so in the last year, we've seen extraordinary footage from some of the Ukrainian units of, guys relieved from a position who've been in there for 6 months. And they come out looking like sort of Robinson Crusoe, with beards and grimy faces. And, one can only imagine how kind of shell-shocked they are, having been under fire for months and months and months without any kind of relief.
Because they just can't move because it's too dangerous.
Yes. And to get guys, say they've lost guys trying to go in, trying to relieve them, they then face this challenge of how on earth are we going to get them out? If someone gets wounded, what are you going to do? So the Ukrainian army was facing quite a morale problem in that, people were watching their comrades bleed out and die in front of them. Nobody could get through, or people were even afraid to try and get through. So over the past year, we've seen the development of uncrewed ground vehicles for the purpose of casualty evacuation. And that has been quite a successful use of those devices because they've been designed so that they can take, a stretcher case. So Ukrainians have started in recent months to use those for casualty evacuation. And of course, they've also been resupplying those forward positions, both by air and ground uncrewed vehicles. So either a drone drops in some more rations or bullets. But I mean, the life of those poor guys in those positions, it's horrifying. It's really become a sort of sterile zone, 20, 30 kilometers on each side of the so-called zero line or the notional front line. And that has spurred the development of uncrewed ground vehicles.
How many deaths are we currently seeing every month in Ukraine right now on both sides?
Between 10 and 15,000 Russians a month have become casualties in this conflict. The Ukrainian figure is considerably less, partly because they really scarcely now put troops in those forward positions. But if you look at the total dead across the war, it's pretty numbing, really. I would say anything between 250 and 300,000 Russians killed.
Oh, wow.
And something in the order of 100 to 120,000 Ukrainians.
It's a huge number of people.
Yeah.
Mark, from my vantage point where I normally sit in Washington, D.C., I think there is an assumption that Ukraine is very needy in this war, that Ukraine needs American weaponry, American money. And so it is really fascinating to hear you tell the story of Ukraine's technological drone innovation and advantages, because I think for many Americans, I would say myself included, the assumption is that America has led the world in defense manufacturing. I guess I want to understand from you how Ukraine has turned this technological innovation into an asset.
Well, of course, what we've seen since the start of the Iran war is that some of the Gulf states coming under bombardment from Iranian long-range strike drones, the so-called Shahed family of drones, they've literally got in touch with the Ukrainians and said, help us out here. Because as we know, in the last year or two, the Ukrainians have sometimes been facing barrages of 600 or 700 of those types of drones a night. And so, of course, they've developed all kinds of systems to find them, to track them, or to shoot them down by various different methods. And of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they wanted all of that. They said, show us how to do this. The Ukrainians have sent experts to the Emirates, Saudi Arabia and Qatar to help them and to deploy active defenses against drones.
And then U.S. military bases as well. Are they utilizing Ukrainian
drones? So this has emerged quite recently. I mean, I think there's been a news agency report that suggests that the Americans are now adopting that technology. They had very costly setbacks at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia in March, where in 2 successive attacks, they were attacked by a combination of drones and missiles. So definitely that's piqued US interest in this. And it is also the case, the Ukrainians have been gloating somewhat about some exercises to train NATO forces in the realities of what it's like to be up against an enemy with drones, yeah.
Are we seeing, at this point, warfare transforming in front of our eyes? Are we going to move to a point soon where battles are being fought solely between robots, essentially?
I always say someone has to charge the batteries on those robots you've just mentioned. Somebody has to create a launch site for them. Somebody has to control them in their current...
Does somebody have to control them?
In their current incarnation, yes. So you can say, well, yes, we're seeing a situation where there are fewer and fewer people in the front line, but then your drone operators are still going to be there somewhere 20, 30 kilometers back from the front line, just as your artillery is.
Could we move to a point where the very, very front line is solely populated by robots?
Yeah, I think you could. There are already systems, like sort of uncrewed guard turrets or whatever with machine guns, but the actual person who operates the machine gun is, many kilometers away.
Mark, that raises all sorts of ethical questions. If you're not really so intimately connected with the actual war you're fighting,
you mean
it
that
changes
the
whole scope
it does.
of how long you're willing to engage in the fight.
But also, that isn't true autonomy. Of course, you can create a system like that with a remote control machine gun, which is just operates autonomously, based on a sort of an image library of what the enemy looks like.
That is terrifying.
These things are happening now on the battlefield.
Throughout our conversation, it sounds like you've described a situation in which the war in Ukraine has in some ways revolutionized modern warfare. And that leaves us wondering, if indeed Vladimir Putin has perhaps accidentally created this innovative fighting machine in Ukraine through his invasion.
Well, he has, yeah, and I suppose it's a little bit like a sort of immune response to a contagion or a virus, isn't it? That he's ended up breeding a stronger Ukraine in that sense. This extraordinary power, these extraordinary cycles of innovation, and yes, they show us the way. But don't underestimate the degree to which the Russians as well have learnt a lot from this. That's the big challenge for Western Europe now, is to, in a sense, to employ that precious know-how that the Ukrainians can give them to prepare their own forces in case things become much more serious with Russia in the future.
Well, that sounds ominous. On that note, thank you so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was great.
Thank you both.
That's it for The Global Story on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. And if you enjoyed our episode today, then I should mention our show, The Global Story, is also available as an audio podcast. You can find us every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen.